weeks in terms of we've had a couple of situations in our country with church security, of course, and so some have asked, what adjustments are we making? And it's interesting to find a good balance because on one hand, we might overreact and we could put up barbed wire and put in a vault and bring in tanks, I guess, or whatever. That'd be sort of one extreme. And even then, we probably can't guarantee perfection. Of course, the other extreme is to act like nothing's happened. And so we're trying to find the balance. There is a plan in place. There has been one for some time. It's very low-key intentionally, and that'll be kind of considered and tuned a little bit. But one of the hard parts in our response to such issues in our world is where do we find the balance between protecting the innocent and having a willingness to suffer? So finding that place is not an easy thing to do. But I just want to tell you that if you have any additional questions, you can talk to the elders, and specifically our elder Steve McLean is addressing that. And like I said, that's been ongoing and it's intentionally low-key, and you can talk to him more about that. So we've been talking about joy for some time, and in the last 2 weeks we've been talking about peace. I like to define peace as the profound sense of well-being. In other words, it's okay. Everything's okay. I'm okay. And the point of peace is it's defined without regard to circumstances. Generally in the world, at least the average thought is, peace is an absence of conflict. And so we might say something like, right now we have peace in the Middle East. That's an expression I've grown up hearing, right? And we use that to mean they're not actively shooting at each other. So does that mean there's peace in that region? No, not at all. And so whenever I define peace or I pursue peace merely as an absence of conflict or define it by circumstances, then I am forever unsatisfied. Because how often does everything go smoothly in life? Jesus said in John 16, in the world you will have tribulation. That's not going to change. So if my idea of peace or my sense of well-being comes from, I got to get everything sorted in life, then I am forever chasing an impossible task. So we've said that in order to have peace, first of all, you have to have peace with God. If you are at odds with your Creator, you are not going to have peace. Secondly, we've said if you do have peace with God, that's lived out, that becomes real, that becomes genuine when we have peace in community. In other words, if you say, John says, if you say you love God and you hate your brother, he calls you a liar. Because it's in community that we live out this truth. It's in community that we practice patience. It's in community that we practice forgiveness, kindness, a willingness to serve. All those things happen horizontally, if you will, in community. But ultimately, what God is offering to us is not only being at peace with Him and being at peace in community, but even being in peace or at peace with ourselves. It is my opinion that one of the greatest tragedies of this struggle we're having in our culture about gender identity, we've decided it's not biology, that it's rather how you feel or how you choose, that at the heart of that, I think, is a struggle to be at peace with ourselves. Have you ever wanted to be somebody you're not? Have you ever looked at someone and they had this amazing athletic ability and you said, man, I wished I was like that. Or maybe they had an incredible ability with music or with art and you said, I wish I was like that. You can spend your whole life desperately trying to be somebody that you cannot be. I think it'd be nice to have a little bit of an artistic ability. I have like zero. When I draw in stick figures and I still have to label them because my cow and my hippo and my giraffe all look the same even when I draw it. Now, I know I could get better at that, I'm sure, if I took a few classes, but I'm also pretty convinced I'm never going to be an artist. So I could go through life frustrated and upset that I could never be a Picasso. I don't know, some of his stuff was weird. I might pull that off. But I'm never going to be able to do this, or I could be at peace with myself. The old way of saying it is living comfortably in your own skin. So Paul talks about in Philippians chapter 4, this concept of being at peace with God is where he starts. Notice, if you would, in verse 6, he says, be anxious for nothing, but in everything, by prayer and supplication, with thanksgiving, let your requests be known to God. and the peace of God, which surpasses all comprehension, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. That's being at peace with your Creator. This is what will guard our mind. It will guard our hearts rather than the negativity or the toxicity that we live in when we're frustrated without peace. But he also talks about community in verse 8 in its application when he says, finally, brethren, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is of good repute, if there is any excellence and if anything worthy of praise, dwell on these things. And here's where he begins to move. This peace with God begins to transcend who we are and transform who we are. He says in verse 9, the things that you have learned and received and heard and seen in me, practice these things, and the God of peace will be with you. So this is learned or experienced in community. Now, as I was thinking about this idea about being at peace with ourselves, see, the Apostle Paul has gotten to that place. Flip over, if you would, here in Philippians in chapter 1, and let's read again what he says in verse 21. Now listen to him talk about peace. So while you're flipping the pages, what are the things that you've been anxious about in the last week or two? What are the things that you've been frustrated about or has made you irritable? One of the things that I'm really frustrated about is my ancient iPhone 5S. Anybody remember those? Is getting slower. Just the other day I went to tap on something and it took like several seconds longer to bring up than I'm accustomed to. And I'm like, oh, come on. Right? Anybody with me? Anybody misplaced their charger cord and you're like, how am I going to get through life with my phone being so low in energy, right? So all the things that we get upset about, we get twisted around. Listen to Paul talk about peace in verse 21 of chapter 1. He says, for to me to live is Christ and to die is gain. But if I'm to live on in the flesh, this will mean fruitful labor for me, and I do not know which to choose. I'm hard pressed, he says, from both directions, having the desire to depart and be with Christ, because that's better. But to remain on the flesh is more necessary for you. Can you imagine that kind of peace? Whether it's through diagnoses or whether it's somebody threatening you, imagine if they said, you're going to have to choose to live or die. What if you said, oh, wow, man, I don't know. I never can decide whether I want to live or die. What kind of statement is that? But see, Paul is living in peace so that even life and death matters have been surrendered. Imagine that. Well, now when I think about what I'm anxious about, what I'm frustrated about, what's got me all worked out, it's nowhere near that level. To be threatened to live or die is to be threatened with heaven, right? Paul said, I'm hard pressed. I don't know. I can't decide. Because to leave would to be with Christ. That'd be great. Well, how do you get from here to heaven? You die. That's the way it happens. Right now, unless we're here and the Lord comes back, we all get on the bus together. That'd be great. But otherwise, the way you get from here to there is death by some means. And Paul says, I don't know. I don't know. What tremendous peace he has even in such an extreme example. Let's flip back to chapter 4 in verse 10. Paul's talking to these brethren about something, and I noticed something in preparation for this series we've been in. This is the lesson I've been most excited about because I saw something I'd never seen before. In verse 10, Paul says, but I rejoiced in the Lord greatly, that now at last you've revived your concern for me. Indeed, you were concerned before, but you have lacked opportunity. Not that I speak from want, for I have learned to be content in whatever circumstances I am. I know how to get along with humble means. I know how to live in prosperity. In any and every circumstance, I've learned the secret of being filled and going hungry, both of having abundance and suffering need. So I'm reading through this, and I realize I've always heard Paul saying something that he doesn't say. Some of us gather on Tuesday nights. There's a Bible study called H4. It's anybody that has hurts, habits, or hang-ups. It's about hope. So we were studying through that, and Patsy Stockstill said something that just blew my doors off. We were going through this passage, and she mentioned something that I realized I've never heard this right. Because when I'm reading this, I hear Paul say, I am content in any circumstance, whether I'm hungry or whether I'm filled, whether I'm in poverty or whether I'm in wealth, I am content. That's not what he said. what hit me was this expression. He said, I have learned to be content. And I thought, wait a minute. Because sometimes Paul gets a little too far away from me. He's the mighty apostle, the great missionary, and I think, well, yeah, that's Paul. He's awesome. He's got it all figured out. But I'm over here struggling. And I let that example separate from my own life. But Paul says, I've learned to be content. And then I started asking myself, how do you learn that? Paul goes through some experiences, does he not? When he says, I've learned to be content in hunger and in times of satisfaction, because he's been both. So it's our experiences, our circumstances that don't determine peace, but teach us how to have peace. Have you ever heard this expression? Is there a difference between having 20 years experience and 1 year's experience repeated 20 times? Have you ever heard that before? The idea is that there are people who will learn, and after 20 years they have all this wisdom from all this experience, but then there's some people can go through the same thing and don't learn a thing. How did God teach David to be a giant slayer? While being a shepherd, of course. That's obvious, right? Oops, no, I didn't see that one coming. But David learns to serve where he is, and he has these experiences. When he finally sees Goliath, he looks around and says, isn't somebody going to do something about that? And his brothers and others are like, are you blind? Have you seen that man? And he says, that's no big deal. And he goes to Saul, and Saul says, here's my armor. And David tries it on, and he says, man, I'm not used to this. I've not learned this way. He says, what I have learned is when the lion attacked my father's sheep, when the bear attacked my father's sheep, I've learned to depend on God's power, so this giant is nothing. He learned it tending sheep. Well, how about Moses? Moses grew up for 40 years in Pharaoh's household, the prince of Egypt, with all the training and all the benefits, all the education of that. He didn't learn it there. He left Egypt in fear at 40 years old, ran out in the wilderness. He spent the next 40 years doing what? Tending sheep. Brethren, we need to buy some sheep. He spent 40 years tending sheep so that when he got in front of Pharaoh, or when he got backed up against the Red Sea, or when he got in front of a thirsty people, he had learned to trust that God would come through. Were they perfect? Of course not. But what they had learned was to trust Him. Because you can keep having the same experiences and never learn from it. We say Moses learned. What about the children of Israel? They cried out for 400 years, God deliver us, God deliver us, God deliver us. So He sends them Moses. And through Moses, they lived through 10 plagues. Some of them they experienced, others they got to watch the Egyptians experience. I'm thinking those are the ones they were cheering for. Yay! But they went through 10 plagues, and they get led out, and the Egyptians let them go, and they give them gold, and it's almost like they had plundered them as a victorious army, and they leave Egypt. They get up against the Red Sea. Pharaoh's army pours over the hill, and what do the Israelites say? Oh, there's not enough graves in Egypt. You've led us out here to be slaughtered. And God's like, I got this. I'll give you the pillar of cloud by day, the pillar of fire by night. I'm going to part the Red Sea. You cross on dry land. I'll collapse it in, take out the Egyptian army. I got you. And then as soon as they get across, they get thirsty. And what do? Oh no, we're going to die of thirst. Why didn't He just kill us in Egypt? And God's like, trust me, I got you. And so here comes water from the rock. He turned bitter water into sweet water. I don't know that God's been by Midland, but He had been by over there. And He had changed the water and made it amazing. And then they said, yeah, but we're going to starve to death. Oh, we wish we were back in Egypt where we had, here's the weird thing, we had leeks. Every time I read that, I'm like, how good can a leek be? It's like a kind of a wild onion kind of thing. It's like, what do you mean the menu? Remember, they were slaves and they were beaten and they were oppressed. And what, the food was great? No. But somehow they had this negative mindset that was filtering everything. Whereas gripe, gripe, grumble, grumble, complain, complain. And God said, I got you, trust me. And so He brings them manna from heaven. He brings them the bread of life out of heaven, and it's so good. They're like manna, which is Hebrew for what is it? I don't even know how to describe this. And it's like honey and like seeds all mixed up. And God's like, I got you so well. You just get up in the morning, step out of your tent, fall face down and chew. There's breakfast. I mean, I got you covered. There's breakfast, there's lunch, there's supper. I got you covered. And they're like, well, yeah, but we're so sick of bread now. Can we have meat? And God's like, oy vey, because He's French. Right? God's like, come on. Over and over and over, God is saying, trust me. Trust me. And there are some people that said, oh, I'll tell you what, God has seen me through worse than this. He's always been with me. He always will. And you're learning from your circumstance. But you can be an Israelite. Well, I know He got me through the Red Sea, but this is thirst. That's a whole different matter. Well, I know He gave us water from a rock, but we need food. Food and water, everybody knows, is not the same. And you can find ways to go over and over and over and reject what God is trying to teach you, and you will reject peace. You will live in chaos. You'll have an insatiable heart and an insatiable soul that never finds rest. It's never enough, we can say. And so Paul says, I have learned. How? By going through it. See, the problem is, I'm already resistant. I'm not into suffering. I'm not. I don't like it when it's inconvenient. I mean, just the other day, I stopped in to get a 44 ounce of goodness. And I recognized, wait a minute, I didn't know they had a drive-through. You're telling me I stood in line for like all of 4 or 5 minutes when I could have just like driven through? Because see, that's where I'm at. It's about an instant text message. It's about microwaving lunch. It's about drive-through. What do you mean inconvenient? Paul says, I have learned through the circumstances. How do you learn to be at peace when you have nothing and when you have everything? By having both of those experiences. Choosing to learn from it. In fact, there's another thing Paul says that really caught my eye in verse 12. He says, I know how to get along with humble means, and I know how to live in prosperity. In any and every circumstance, I have learned the secret. I don't know about you, but that language intrigues me. Whoa. He says, I've learned the secret, which means it's not common knowledge. You know what the problem with common sense is? It's not as common as it ought to be. A secret means it's not common knowledge. This is not how the world lives. This is not the majority of how people decide to live. He said, I have learned the secret of being filled and going hungry, both of having abundance and suffering need. Now look, if you would, at the next verse. We're going to talk about the secret, because I think he's going to reveal it for us. But he says in verse 13, he says, I can do all things through Him who strengthens me. That has got to be one of the most widely plastered scripture on Christianese stuff. It's used to cover, if I got a game coming up and I'm nervous and it's time for a free throw, I can say, God, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. Now, I know that it's no big deal for God to guide a basketball. I mean, He's got that power. That's no big deal, and He may choose to. But it's interesting how we start using that for this struggle I have over here, this challenge I have over here. What's the context of what Paul's talking about? He's talking about, I have learned in every circumstance. Well, now what kind of circumstances? Some positive and some negative. Some easy, some comfortable, some hard, some miserable. He says, I have learned in those circumstances. Paul, how did you do that? Well, it's easy. You just gotta get the right attitude. The problem is, I'm not impressed with my willpower, are you? You just gotta, no, you don't got it. See, me gotta is what's gotten me into this place in the first place. So he says, it's Christ who strengthens me. That's how Paul's able to learn. Flip over to Acts chapter 16. Put your marker in Philippians. We're going to be back. Run over to Acts chapter 16. When the Apostle Paul is encouraging the church like this is something they know with him. This isn't just theoretical to them. Because in Acts chapter 16, the Apostle Paul has been sharing Jesus Christ, and the same things happened to him here. This happened a lot. Some people believed, and then it created a ruckus. Other people got jealous, and then Paul gets in trouble. Now, in chapter 15, Paul and Barnabas had a disagreement about what to do with a guy named John Mark. So Barnabas takes John Mark and goes off on a mission trip, and then Paul takes Silas, and they go off on a mission trip. And so in chapter 16, things are going well, people are starting to believe, and then the trouble comes. The circumstances change and negative things happen. In fact, Paul and Silas are arrested. They're beaten with rods with many blows. They're thrown into prison, stuck in stocks. So now they're bruised and they're swollen and they're sore and they're uncomfortable in these stocks. And every time I read this, I'm thinking Silas has got to be thinking, man, I wish I'd have gone with Barnabas. Because I mean, he gets to go with Paul, and look what happens. They get beat up. Unjustly, unfairly. And while they're in the stocks, about midnight, what happens? Well, this is a great place to say, God, why did you let this happen? God, why don't you fix this? God, why don't you get even with them? Because this is unfair, this is unjust, this isn't right. And all of that would be accurate. And what I would have learned from that circumstance was nothing. I'd have been out just as gripey and just as grumbling as I was when I went in. But what we find out in Acts 16 and verse 25, that when midnight comes, Paul and Silas are worshiping God. In fact, they're singing and praying praise to God. How do you do that? How do you really do that when your lips are swollen and cracked and bloody and you can't see out of one eye and your body aches and hurts? How do you do that? Paul says, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. That's what he's talking about. Left to our own devices? No, we don't have that kind of willpower. It's a good thought, and I can mentally agree with it, but how am I going to sustain that all the way through midnight? I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. And there's Paul praying and praising God, thanking God. God brings the earthquake, the doors come open, the chains fall off, and no prisoners leave. They'd rather listen to that worship than find their own freedom in the world. Isn't that something? The Philippian jailer rushes in thinking everybody's gone, and he's about to kill himself, and Paul says, don't do that, we're all here. And because of that, the Philippian jailer and his whole household become Christians. They're baptized into Christ, and the church in Philippi begins in Acts 16. So when Paul writes back to them a few years later, this book of Philippians, this is something they've lived together. When he says, I have learned to be content in all circumstances, he's not just blowing smoke. There's at least one guy in the auditorium that morning going, amen. Man, I'll never forget that night. Man, I saw you got brought into jail. I wasn't sure of the circumstances, but boy, you were one bloody mess. And you had a really different look on your face. You weren't scowling. You weren't plotting revenge. You weren't suffering unjustly as far as you're going to get even with us. Instead, you had this weird thing. You were thanking God. And I thought, that guy is either crazy or he's got something I don't have. See, when Paul says, man, I have learned to be content, the Philippian jailer at least can say, amen, that's right. Boy, that's the truth. I've seen that. And I wonder, I don't know what their terms were of their imprisonment and where they were from, but you got to ask yourself, I wonder how many prisoners also became Christians, and would they have been a part of that Philippian church a few years later? What a cool church that must have been. They had learned in their circumstances to be content. Let's go back to Philippians chapter 4. What is the secret, Paul, of being content in every circumstance? Well, if you'll stop at 2 Corinthians chapter 12, I think Paul reveals it. 2 Corinthians chapter 12. I think this is the secret. He says in verse 7, he says, because of the surpassing greatness of the revelations, for this reason, to keep me from exalting myself, there was given me a thorn in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me, to keep me from exalting myself. Did you just disconnect from Paul? I've known some people, they exalt themselves, they're walking around like they're all that. Do we ever exalt ourselves? You see, when I struggle to forgive, it's because I exalt myself. Because I'm thinking, you don't treat me like that. Not me. You treat somebody else like that, but not me. When I struggle to serve, it's because that's not something I want to do. We struggle with exalting ourselves all the time. And Paul says, that's why God gave me a thorn. In fact, a messenger of Satan to torment me. That doesn't sound comfortable. That sounds like some circumstances where things weren't going well, that something wasn't right. And he says of this situation in verse 6 or verse 8, concerning this, I begged the Lord 3 times that it might leave me. Please take this away. Why would God allow one of His best missionaries to be impaired? Isn't that crazy? Why would God allow the powerful Apostle Paul to be held back or restricted because he's got some kind of issue? Wouldn't it be better when he says, please bless me, Lord, please take this away so I can do more for you? Wouldn't God have said, oh yes, here, let me empower you to do more? But you know what God said? He gives him the secret. Because he said, I asked, because this really hurt. This was really hard. I asked. And he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for power is perfected in weakness. There's the secret. Because right here, even in 2 Corinthians, the conversation shifts. It pivots right here. Because he's going to go on to say, most gladly, therefore, all of a sudden there's celebration, all of a sudden there's joy, where before there was this circumstance of pain and this sincere prayer, deliver me. It changes. Right after that. Right after the Lord says, my grace is sufficient for you. Because that's the challenge. Is Jesus sufficient for us? When you go back to the children of Israel's example, they kept saying, what about this? We need this. What about this? We need this. When do they learn in those circumstances, if you have God, you have everything you need? See, I know that. I even believe that. But do I accept it? Because the next time I'm frustrated in traffic, the next time the electronic doohickey's not doing what it's supposed to, the next time there's a misunderstanding with a person at work or even in our homes or the other places where we struggle in our circumstances, is Jesus enough? My grace is sufficient for you. You mean I don't get an answer to my question? No. Do I get resolution to my problem? No. Do I get rescued from this tribulation? No. Why? Because there's something that must be learned. Moses learned it for 40 years herding sheep. The Israelites spent 40 years wandering in the wilderness and never learned it. How is it that some people can learn things and they develop such joy, such peace, such wisdom, such calmness, such serenity, and maybe someone else who haven't suffered as much can be so negative and so toxic and so down? Because it's determined by whether or not we choose to learn the secret. And the secret is, part 1, is Jesus sufficient for you? Number 2, he says, for my power is perfected in weakness. So what do you want? Remember, he started off, to keep me from exalting myself. See, the thing is, I like to succeed. I want to get ahead. I want to be impressive. I want to find the answers. Jesus says, my power is perfected in weakness. So whose power are we living for? Who is it that we desire to be seen in us? See, I know that. I believe that. But do I accept that? My power is perfected in weakness, Jesus says. And this is what turns the conversation. Suddenly the whole language changes, and Paul says, most gladly, therefore, I'd rather boast about my weaknesses so that the power of Christ may dwell in me. Therefore, I am well content with weaknesses, with insults, distresses, persecutions, plain old difficulties for Christ's sake. For when I'm weak, then I'm strong. So how do I, practice that? I really appreciated what Steve said in the Crossroads class this morning. He said there's an important difference in being convicted and being condemned. Condemned is Satan's work that destroys you. You have no hope. You're no good. Convicted is, I need to learn from this. So how do I work on this? Well, let's end in Philippians chapter 4. Paul shows us. Because Paul said, I've learned. All right, Paul, can you give me like a couple of steps? Can you give me a couple of ideas? How did you get there? Because he didn't just get there by himself either. That was that thorn in the flesh as an example where he struggled to find contentment. So how do you learn it? Well, call to mind whatever was the most aggravating thing you went through last week. Probably involves a person. Whatever that was, whatever just kind of like, that moment where your peace was taken from you or you allowed it to be taken from you and you were stomping around on the inside or the outside and you had your fists balled up and you were grumbling under your breath and you're just like, rah, 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 and it was not a peaceful moment for you. Here's what Paul shows us to do. Back to verse 4. Chapter 4, verse 4. He says, rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I will say rejoice. What? You're going to have to decide this morning that when you encounter a struggle, a circumstance you don't like, you're going to have to tell yourself, I will rejoice. And it'll sound really funny. Because you're going to rejoice through gritted teeth. You're going to rejoice with that vein on your forehead bulging out. Because this isn't I feel like it. This is I'm going to say it. I'm going to say it. In fact, look in verse 6. He says, be anxious for nothing, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be known to God. I'm going to thank God. I'm going to praise God and I'm going to thank God for every circumstance. Paul, you're crazy. Yeah, that's where he was in jail, remember? Beaten, bruised, in stocks. What's he doing? He's rejoicing and he's thanking God. It'll rock your world. And it will change the world around you. Because people are going to be forced to make a decision that they either have just met the craziest person they've ever witnessed, or there's something going on. Paul says, I've learned, you see, I rejoice in everything. Oh, sure, the positive things, but I rejoice in the hard things. And I thank God for the hard things. And it changes his focus. He says in verse 7, and the peace of God, which surpasses all comprehension, will guard your hearts and guard your minds. Don't go down that road. Because you can practice all the negativity you want to. You can have that speech driving down Midland Drive, and you can bring to mind all the reasons why, and you can list, enumerate, and alphabetize all the justifications. And you have no peace. Or, in verse 8, what is true? What is honorable? What's right? What's pure? What's lovely? Could I think on that? Can I think on what is of good repute, of what builds people up? Can I think on excellence, things worthy of praise? I'll dwell on those things. Not on how I was treated, not on how something should have been done. I'm going to dwell on those things. And Paul says that is the pathway to peace. That's the secret. He said in 2 Corinthians 12, the secret was, Jesus said, my grace is sufficient for you, my power is perfected in weakness. He said the secret in Philippians, it was verse 13, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. That's the secret. Jesus is everything I need. Because when that happens, when I accept that, when I surrender to that, then even in chapter 1, verse 21, he says, I'm hard-pressed, I don't know, live, die, do this, don't do that, I don't know, that he has given up the anxiety that we would associate with such moments. And so I ask you, are you at peace? Wherever there is turmoil in your heart, wherever there is chaos in your mind, perhaps it's an instrument that God is using to prompt you or to probe you to make an appointment with the great physician. Most of us will only seek help when it hurts so much that we're finally motivated. Wherever there's chaos, wherever there's a lack of peace, is that not the Spirit prompting us to find healing? Paul said, I was given a thorn. Why? Because I keep exalting myself. that he needed it, and that it was good for him. This morning, if we can encourage you in any way in the path to peace, we can walk alongside of you in the process of surrender, then that's what we want to do as brothers and sisters in this beautiful family of Christ.